Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to get a chance to welcome you to today's conversation. I want to thank our MIT's Department of Economics and the MIT Sloan School for helping to organize the conversation this afternoon. The topic of today's conversation, the new paradigm for financial markets, is also the title of the most recent book by our distinguished guest, George Soros. And as I'm sure we are all acutely aware, there couldn't be a better time or a better place, or frankly, better company for this conversation. MIT has a tradition of being open to hearing controversial views, and in a complex, uncertain time like the present, it's important that we get all views out into conversation. Guiding the conversation this afternoon will be Professor Ricardo Caballero. He is the Ford International Professor of Economics and head of the Department of Economics, which is widely considered among the very best in the world. Professor Caballero is also co-director of the World Economic Laboratory and an NBER Research Associate in Economic Fluctuations and Growth. His own work has particular relevance to this moment. He considers global capital markets, speculative episodes in financial bubbles, and how, or from today's perspective, whether there are mechanisms that could prevent or mitigate systemic crises. Professor Caballero's background is clearly well attuned to the present, but of course, so is that of our guest, George Soros. Starting in the 1970s, George Soros made a name for himself and a fair amount of money as leader of the Quantum Fund, among the original hedge funds, and one whose performance has never been surpassed. More recently, he's made his mark as an author, a brilliant philanthropist, a supporter of emerging democracies, and the founder of the Open Society Institute. He has been prescient in his understanding of the impending financial crisis and its magnitude. He predicted the burst of the housing bubble well in advance of most others and recognized the gravity of the current crisis well before it was obvious to most. We are absolutely delighted to have Mr. Soros here today to engage in a conversation. We welcome him to the MIT campus, and we all look forward to his conversation with Professor Caballero, and the floor will be open for questions after some introductory questions between the two of our guests this afternoon. Thank you very much.
So it's a great honor for me to introduce and moderate a discussion with Mr. George Soros. He's not only a legendary speculator, and his name is a brand in itself, but as Susan mentioned, he has shown a deep concern for making a difference in this world in a wide variety of areas. The book, which provides a background for today's discussion, offers a fascinating mixture of personal experiences, history of science, philosophy of science, real-time finance, economic forecasts, and policy prescriptions, everything in less than 160 pages, or slightly more than 160 pages. But I think one of the points, this book is a bit like a polyphony. There are many layers and many voices, and some of them really sound like music. But I think one of the mega messages of the book is that it makes sense to talk about all these things at the same time, because they are intertwined through the principle of reflexivity. And trying to disentangle them, to talk about things in isolation, as we tend to do in the natural sciences, risks missing the big picture. And that's sort of a subliminal and sometimes explicit message present in the book. The book is a powerful explanation of how rigid imposition of simple equilibrium models can lead to counterfactual predictions and inappropriate policy recommendations. I really share that view. Moreover, I would argue that that's very distinctive of MIT's economics department. It's an eclectic department where we don't shy away from looking at the frictions, even though it makes our models a bit clumsier. But I think we try to focus on the frictions and in understanding how those frictions modify the outcomes of the simple models and how they fundamentally change, many times fundamentally change the policy prescription. So it's important for us, Mr. Soros, that somebody with your wisdom and with your experience supports this research agenda. It's very encouraging to us. Now, the plan for today, as I'm understanding, is that I will ask a few questions. I will try to guide you through the book. So I will at least attempt to follow the structure of the book, but I understand that you may want to deviate, and you have a good tradition in doing so, but that will make it only more interesting. So I'll try to follow the book, and I want to separate the set of questions into 4 groups. The first one is the early chapters, is about your life and how the concept of reflexivity developed, again, as a result of your growth both in your life and in the financial markets. Then I want us to start moving towards the crisis, but rather than plunging directly in the current crisis, I want to talk to you about the structure, the global structure, the financial structure, the economic structure, what you call the super bubble. And then I want us to understand a bit how the real estate bubble fits within the super bubble. And finally, I want us to conclude with the current crisis. The book is fascinating. It stops halfway through the crisis. And so there's a few chapters to be written, and probably we can discuss them right here.
Well, it's a long agenda you got, so
yes.
I hope we can cover
so I'll
it
interrupt
all.
you frequently, so we keep it then. So the first question is, I would like you to tell us a little bit about your early steps in life, in the financial world, and how that led to the reflexivity principle and ideas.
Well, looking back, I would say that the formative year of my life was 1944. Being a Hungarian Jew, Hungary was occupied by the Germans, and we would have been deported and killed in Auschwitz. Fortunately, my father had some previous experience with far from equilibrium situations like this, because he lived through the Russian Revolution. So with that experience, he understood that there are times when the normal rules don't apply. And so he took care of his family and a number of other people in false papers and so on. And we survived, all of us, most of us survived that period. And that was, in a way, the sort of the formative experience of my life. Then I went to England, studied economics. I didn't get much past the elementary economics, perfect competition with the assumption of perfect knowledge. And at the same time, I was reading Karl Popper, Open Society and Its Enemies, which was probably the most influential book in my intellectual development, because his explanation of fascism and communism, after I've experienced both of them, was very enlightening to me. And of course, the idea of perfect knowledge was totally opposed to his theory of science. And so that's when I started thinking about the relationship between us as thinking participants and the reality of our situation. And that was the beginning of and this really when I formulated this idea of reflexivity.
One interesting concept here is that in economics we have, typically when we try to understand multiple equilibria, which we call indeterminacy, we exchange the terms, that arises in economics. We use it to explain crisis because essentially it's very difficult to find shocks out there which are large enough to explain what happens in a crisis, these very large implosions of asset prices and so on. But the typical way it works in economics is by this occurs in situations where we care too much about the expectations of others. And you seem to have found that in a sort of broader and even principle, which is this principle of reflexivity. It seems to apply far more broadly than the very specific circumstances where we find it. So the question is why? Why is it so encompassing?
Look, let's say the basic proposition, and this may be helpful. I mean, the book deals with 4 levels of abstraction. There was this level of reflexivity as a general concept, which states that there's a structural difference between natural phenomena and human phenomena, because in natural phenomena, thinking doesn't enter into the phenomena themselves. So there's only a cognitive function of trying to understand what goes on. Whereas in human situations, you also have a participating function. You actually try to change the situation. So on the one hand, you have the cognitive function where your thinking supposed to reflect reality. And the other hand, you've got this manipulative or participating function where you affect reality. And those two functions interfere with each other, as a result of which neither function has a determinate result. So you can't base your decisions on knowledge, because you are affecting what you are thinking about, and therefore your actions have unintended consequences. And so your imperfect understanding is a very important influence in determining the course of events. So this path dependence is very much due to imperfect understanding.
I mean, in economics, we do take into account that, but you seem to be saying something beyond that, which is that somehow stories are always going to be different. Mm-hmm. Is that you can't predict how people will react to this participation.
Well, I mean, the idea that you should be able to predict the future is really a nonsense, because the future is determined by the decisions that people take. And since they don't base their decisions on knowledge or on, we'll call it, rational expectations, their decisions, I mean, you know, the way Secretary Paulson reacted to Lehman Brothers.
We're going to talk about that.
I mean, I just bring that up as an example. You know, that changed the course of history. So how could you predict that? So, I mean, I think that I have a theory that explains the current crisis better than, let's say, the prevailing paradigm. But it cannot predict it. And I find it very frustrating that, you know, with all my great, deep understanding, I don't get the market right.
Well, you get it right more frequently than others, no? That's what matters at the end. There is another concept, and this is the last conceptual question before we get into the crisis, but there's another concept in economics which is called social learning, and that's essentially that you know, we learn from the actions of others, and in those models, what typically happens is that the early entrants make money and the late entrants lose money, and typically ruin the business. And I think you say this very nicely in your book. I think you call it the Peters principle. You say ideas that work well will be exploited to the point that they do not work anymore. And you seem to be saying that the reflexivity principle will always imply that. And I wonder, how did you come to this idea?
No, I mean, as a working hypothesis, you see, you have this, let's say, rational expectations theory that markets are always right. And I think as a working hypothesis, it's much better to assume that the markets are always wrong. In other words, there's always reflect the existing state of affairs in a distorted or biased way. But the prevailing perception of the market actually affects the so-called fundamentals that market prices are supposed to reflect. That's the reflexivity. And that's something that is endemic. That is the nature of financial systems. Now, bubbles are a particular manifestation of this two-way connection, where initially you always have a misconception involved. But initially, reality actually confirms, reinforces both the trend and the misconception. So it becomes a self-reinforcing process until the misinterpretation of reality becomes so glaring that it's unsustainable. Then usually you have a kind of a period where people go on, dancing even though they realize that, the music is about to stop, or, and then you have a reversal. So it's a non-linear process. That's a bubble which is initially self-reinforcing and eventually self-defeating, so reversed. Now, this doesn't happen very often. It's actually more the exception than the rule, because usually markets actually correct their own mistakes. So the feedback that you get from the market initially is self-defeating. The misconception is defeated. But occasionally you have this self-reinforcing.
Is there a pattern in this occasionally?
Pardon?
Is there a pattern in this occasionally? When does it happen? Is it policy mistakes? Is it?
Well, there's always two elements. There is a trend that occurs in reality. It can be, let's say, ever-increasing use of leverage. Mm-hmm. That's one of the effects. Or it can be the discovery of internet and the technological innovation that goes with it. That's something that really happens. And then there's a misinterpretation. And those two elements interact in a reflexive way, and occasionally they set off this self-reinforcing process. That's how you had the internet bubble. That was based on this misinterpretation of technical development or innovation. And the other one is typical. The most common bubble is actually in real estate. Mm-hmm. Yes. And there, the misconception is that the price of the real estate is independent of the willingness to lend. And strangely, this is a misconception that keeps on recurring in different guises throughout history.
Before we get into the real estate bubble, though, let's talk about the real one, the
Right.
super bubble.
Right.
Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Well, you see, so you have this, just to take you down the abstractions. First, you have this theory of natural phenomena and human phenomena having a different structure. Then you have the application in financial markets, which is, I think, endemic. It's always there. But then you have the specific bubble formation is one manifestation of reflexivity, but you have others, and some others are there all the time. And then you have the interpretation of this particular bubble, where I contend that you have the housing bubble in the US, which was just a relatively small bubble. It was like a detonator, which then set off a much bigger explosion of the super bubble. And that super bubble has been growing for at least 25 years. And it has two components. One is expansion of credit and use of leverage. And the other one is a misconception, which I call market fundamentalism, a belief that markets can correct their own mistakes and markets should be left to their own devices. And that became the dominant creed around 1980, with Margaret Thatcher in England, Reagan in the US, and it led to the globalization of financial markets, the deregulation of financial markets, and the freedom to engage in financial engineering. And the financial engineering was based on this false concept of markets tending towards equilibrium and deviations being random, which neglects the possibility of self-reinforcing processes was left out of account.
Well,
It was assumed away.
Regulation is supposed to take care of that.
Yeah, but then the regulators themselves believed that markets are self-regulating. And you see, what happened was, because this belief was false, actually, markets left to their own devices created one crisis after another. But each time, the regulators intervened, and they solved the problem. They merged away the failing institution, Continental Illinois, or the savings and loans, or whatever it was, and provided fiscal stimulus or monetary stimulus in order to avoid the real economy being affected. And so these financial crises, periodic financial crises, served as successful tests of the misconception of market fundamentalism. And this financial crisis, it plays a different role. This is the reversal point. This is when the authorities have lost control, cannot deal with and you have a real collapse. So the periodic crises serve to reinforce the misconception.
Now, associated to this collapse of the super bubble, you also talk about the collapse of the US-centric world and things of that nature.
Well, I mean, this has a lot to do with it because market fundamentalism and the global financial system has the United States as the dominant force within it. It's the Washington consensus that prevailed. And it served the interests of the United States extremely well, because with the authorities ensuring that the system, if it's threatened, will not collapse, they were a little bit less concerned about the countries at the periphery of the system. So if they got into trouble, then they were subject to market discipline. And they took the consequences. So you had very severe, the first big crisis was the international banking crisis that came to a head in 1982 with Mexico saying, you know, I'm about to default. So then the central banks got together, they saved the system, but they didn't save Mexico. Mexico went through the ringer, and so did Latin America. Latin America had a decade loss.
Chilean. I remember the experience very well.
You know it well.
Yes.
and
that's the reason I'm here.
Right. And that's why you have some sympathy with my position. So, and then you had also, you had then in 1997, you had the emerging market crisis. But again, when it came to long-term capital management defaulting or about to default, the system was held together. The Indonesia, Korea, and so on went through the ringer. So because of that, capital felt safer, financial capital felt safer at the center. So America was able to suck up the savings of the world. And for 25 years, we have had an ever-increasing budget deficit, current account deficit, which eventually reached 6.5%, 7% of GDP. And we've been consuming more than we were producing. And that was, so we had the benefit of the system. And I had a conversation on this subject with Alan Greenspan. I asked him to read my book. He was kind enough to do it. And we then discussed it. And he said, you know, actually, financial innovation brings such great benefits that it outweighs the cost of having occasional bubbles, and then you have to pick up the pieces. And actually, until this crisis, on a cost-benefits basis, he had an argument, because you have had a period of unprecedented prosperity in the United States.
Well,
if you think of
Keynes made the same point about the Great Depression, actually, many years back.
Right. So until now, it was self-justifying, until eventually it became self-defeating. And we are now in the self-defeating.
But let me bring you back to the US-centric world. You seem to be implying that now savings will not come to the US, but there aren't that many alternatives. I mean, Europe doesn't look much better. Japan doesn't look much better. The emerging markets were safe until a week ago, but now they're in trouble as well. So,
well, this is the really fascinating thing, because this is the important thing to realize about this crisis, that this was not an extraneous shock, as the prevailing paradigm would tell you, that it's always an external shock that the system can't absorb. This is not an external shock. This was generated inside the system, so it's self-generated. Secondly, it originated at the center, and it affected the center. But in the end, even now, after the mistake of allowing Lehman to default, that was the turning point where things fell apart, and effectively the financial system genuinely melted down. And so the authorities had to throw all consideration of moral hazard out of the window. By the end of the week, Secretary Paulson came with his $700 billion plan. And then, when that didn't work, eventually, after just in the last 2-3 weeks, basically all the developed countries decided they can't allow another major institution to go in default, and effectively guaranteed depositors for their deposits. That gave some confidence to people at the center. And then there was an unintended consequence, a flood of capital away from the periphery back to the center. So in the end, the periphery got hit more heavily, even now. And I will argue in an article that will be published in tomorrow's Financial Times that we have got to do something. The IMF has a new mission. It has to protect the periphery countries against the storm at the center.
Well, that was the old mission, or the intermediate mission of the IMF. Now it's going back to the original mission,
right.
Bretton Woods II.
Right.
So you have views on that?
Right.
On Bretton Woods II, is something we should do or not?
Yeah. So this is why the system lasted that long, because it actually benefited those who were in charge of the global financial system, namely the United States, with its veto power in the IMF.
I suspect, though, that it's going to be hard to turn that around for the reasons you mentioned. The US-centric system, because it's going to continue to be the most attractive system, because at the end of the day, you do whatever you do to save the center, and therefore the periphery is less certain.
I don't think so. I think that unless actually the United States now leads a international effort to stabilize the system, which includes the periphery countries, I think the system will not continue.
Oh, I agree with you, but I see no possibility that they don't try to stabilize the US.
No, but I think that I don't expect this president to do it.
Oh, that's.
But I expect.
That's a different thing.
But I expect the next president to do it, because otherwise, the system will not continue. There will be a different system. that will emerge. And I think the United States will not have the kind of influence that it has now.
I have the sense from reading, one of the most fascinating parts of your book was actually the real-time high finance chapter. Yeah. And I have the sense from the last entry that I saw there that you must have lost a little bit of money with the dollar. No? So probably it is again, you're hoping for this to end, but somehow...
No, I think basically, to bring it up to date, I made two mistakes. I thought that the periphery would be actually more unscathed than it turned out.
You were almost right.
And actually, no, but actually the Chinese and the Indian market went down a lot more than ours. So I had to run awfully fast to stay more or less in the same place to make up for that mistake. And also the strength of the recent strength of the dollar took some adjustment that also cost money.
But I think the recent strength of the dollar is, you just described it. I think you described it very well. No? It's the fact that you're trying to save the center before the periphery will naturally stabilize the dollar.
But I think that the strength of the dollar today is like to me...
Vis-a-vis what?
Vis-a-vis the strength of the dollar now.
Yeah, but the dollar relative to what?
To all the other currencies except the yen. Except the yen. Yeah. The yen is even stronger than the dollar, and of course yields even less than the dollar. But other than that, against the euro, but particularly the periphery currencies. So you had the Eastern European members of the European Union in deep trouble, the Asian countries, and of course Brazil, that had been the great beneficiary of the commodities bubble. Incidentally, that's another very interesting thing which happened since I wrote the book, that you actually had the rise in commodities eventually have ended in a bubble. Yes. And you did have a total boom-bust sequence, for instance, in oil going from $70 to $140, back to
to put the money for a while.
Right. So because people were fleeing from the dollar, and the other currencies weren't that attractive, so there was a flight to commodities. Yes. And that created the commodities bubble, which has now also collapsed.
So let me take you back to the crisis, the domestic crisis, and in particular to the real estate crisis. So what happened there? Can you explain us sort of the connection between real estate prices, MBS, CDOs, and then...
well, you had well-established fact that Greenspan kept interest rates too low too long. It's now even he has recognized that this was a mistake. So that was one of the starting points.
Did he recognize that? I think he recognized that he did not regulate, or he trusted the financial markets too much, but I'm not sure
well, maybe
he has considered the interest rate.
Maybe not. At any rate, that was one factor. So you had this generated housing, demand for housing. Then you had the securitization of mortgages, and the various synthetic instruments which did not take into account the effect that securitization and the use of synthetic instruments would have on housing prices. In other words, didn't take into effect their own influence on the market, which created a new situation.
Well,
so,
and vice versa, I would argue. And vice versa, I would argue. They did not take into account the effect of the declining housing prices on the whole, and the value of the entire asset class.
Right. No? So you had double-digit growth in housing, and this misconception that the value of houses is independent of the willingness to lend. So with the increase in the value of collateral, there's more and more use of leverage, and the increased willingness to lend with the experience of practically no defaults, people became very loose in their lending habits. And so, and then you had this idea that you can actually reduce risk by geographic diversification. In actual fact, you increased risk by separating the agent from the principal. The agent who was creating the mortgages and the principal that was owning the mortgages. The agent was interested in earning fees and did not have the interests of the mortgage owner at heart because he had no financial interest, because securitization allowed him to get rid of the obligation. He didn't own it, separating the agent from the thing. That led to the bubble. And the really interesting thing is that when you take socialism, but Marxist ideology, basically wonderful understanding of global capitalism that Marx was capable of, he made one mistake. He didn't understand the agent-principal problem. Mm-hmm. So by nationalizing everything, he forgot that the people who run the country won't have the interests of the people at heart, but will do things for their own thing. And market fundamentalism came a cropper on the same agent-principal problem as Marxism. I think that's where the two ideologies meet. I find that rather fascinating.
Yes. And why did it break?
When?
Why did it break?
Why did it break?
Yeah, I mean,
well, because it became unsustainable. Now,
so what is unsustainable? Do you think that 70% of home ownership is just not sustainable? It's not a...
No, it's that you could, in the end, borrow over 100% of the inflated value of houses with no security.
But that's what you need to do if you want to have 70%. That's what you need to do if you want 70% of people to own a home.
Yes, and of course the people who got hurt are the recent, the people less qualified to own houses. So it's really the minorities, the old people and black and Hispanic populations who got really hurt. Pardon?
What do we do about that?
Well, we must actually do something about it, which hasn't been done. I mean, you have to downsize the mortgages to the current value. In other words, unless you do that, within a year or so, about more than 20 million households would have mortgages whose value exceeds the house. You have to eliminate, and then with unemployment, people would start walking away from their homes. And when that becomes socially acceptable, you would have a real...
Well, it's already happening in some pockets, no?
It's beginning. So you have to downsize the mortgages to reduce the principal to 80% of the current value of the homes. And then maybe house prices might drop another 10%, but you still have positive equity. Now, this creates it is a very serious problem because to forcefully change the terms of a contract ex post facto is actually unconstitutional, right? So how do you do it? I think it needs to be done, and I think it can be done, but it's going to be very difficult.
Now, let's go back to policy making here. You already criticized the intervention of Lehman, or the lack of intervention of Lehman. But I have the sense that the policy team was behind the curve for quite a while, no? Yes. And so this was just a final mistake. But do you think they have caught up finally?
No.
Okay.
No. Unfortunately, and this is why I have to confess that while I predicted that this is going to be the most serious crisis of my lifetime, the most serious crisis since the 1930s, I did not anticipate the severity of this crisis. I did not expect the system actually to melt down. That was a specific mistake of this administration, unpredictable. So,
really?
So it's gone much further than I thought it would, and unfortunately, the Secretary Paulson has really been consistently lagging, not recognizing the severity of the crisis, and then not taking the necessary steps to.
What are the necessary steps?
Pardon?
What are the necessary steps now?
Well, I would say that you have got three issues that need to be resolved. One, you have to restart lending. You have to recapitalize the banks and actually encourage them to lend. Now, I put forward a scheme for doing it, and to some extent, he actually moved over, because I said that you have to inject equity rather than take off the bad loans, because equity has 12 times the impact.
Unless you have a debt overhang, unless you have a debt overhang, which is part of the problem, no? Because you inject equity and you're essentially just increasing the value of the long-term debt. So that's the part of the issue.
Yeah, but you can then, you see, my proposal was to inject equity in the form of a convertible bond with a low coupon, which was correct, 5%, because you don't want to impair their ability to earn, but make the bonds convertible, which dilutes the existing shareholders. But you offer the rights to subscribe to the shareholders, so they are not diluted if they make up for the shortfall in the equity. And the rights would be tradable. If they don't have money, I will buy some and I'll subscribe. So I think they would have been, probably would have been subscribed by the market, because it would have been, and if not, the Treasury would subscribe. So the Treasury would act as an underwriter. Mm-hmm. That would have been the right thing. Then, and it would have been compulsory in the sense that the bank examiners would tell the Treasury how much additional equity is needed to bring them up to the 8% minimum capital requirement. Then I would lower the minimum capital requirement to 6%. So they are free to lend. Mm-hmm. And then they would want to put the capital to use, and they would start competing for loans. So you'd reopen the banking system.
The Nordics did something like this.
They did, but you wouldn't have had to nationalize it, because I think that the shareholders would have put up the money. So that's number one. Number two, you have to solve you have to prevent housing prices from overshooting on the downside the way they overshot on the upside. Therefore, you have to reduce foreclosures to a minimum, to restrict the supply. And then for
this is with your mortgage measure.
this is the mortgage reorganization. And there I propose this Danish system and so on. And the third is to stabilize the global economy and to enable countries which are following or have followed sound macro policies, their finances are sound, like let's say Brazil, to allow them to run fiscal deficit, very nice old Keynesian anti-cyclical domestic stimulation, because that's the only way that you can avoid a worldwide depression. So those are the three, now, these are the three elements that need to be put together.
So the TARP is not needed?
No, the TARP would be used for the equity injection.
Oh, I see.
The 700 billion would be more than enough.
So you're not worried about the periphery of the financial system within the U.S., hedge funds? I think
no. I think that probably what would happen, what will happen anyhow, is that the so-called shadow banking will be absorbed by deposit banking. The investment banking model is not sustainable. So effectively, it would be consolidated in regulated banking companies. And the hedge fund industry is going to go through a shakeout. It's going to, I think, in my estimation, will be reduced in size by anywhere between half and 2/3.
So you have us out of the crisis. How do we? Now you have us out of the crisis.
Yeah.
So how do we fix the system so we don't get into the next one? Or is reflexivity something that?
I think you'll always have reflexivity, and you'll
So
always
how do we tame it?
and markets will always be unpredictable, and you will always have a tendency towards bubble formation. However, the regulators have to accept responsibility for preventing bubbles from growing too big. That would require the use of judgment. And they're bound to get it wrong. It's inevitable because they are also human. But they would get feedback from the market so they could correct their mistakes. So right now, the regulators have, the authorities have expressly rejected responsibility for dealing with asset bubbles, saying we don't have enough instruments. And they are right, because using merely monetary tools.
With one caveat, though, I was in one of these meetings. There was an asymmetry. They thought they had no tools to deal with this ex ante, which is right, monetary policy at least, but they also thought they had the tools to deal with this ex post after the crisis. And now they have learned that they don't. So,
in other words, instead of waiting for it to blow up and then picking up the pieces, they have actually got to prevent it from growing too big.
but I'm saying they're going to be more willing to listen to that now because they
Yeah,
know
I think
that
so. I think there is a discussion now. Yes. But you see, in order to deal with asset bubbles, you can't deal with them with monetary tools alone. Just controlling interest rates is not enough, because credit and money don't go hand in hand. In other words, monetarism is also a false doctrine, because markets do have moods. And with the same money supply, you can have a credit expansion or credit contraction.
So you want them to intervene on margin requirements.
So you have to, not only do you have to employ them more actively, but you also have to vary them to counterbalance. So it used to be the case when I was young that, they changed the margin requirements in stocks. Up and down, depending on the market levels. They have to go back to that. That's what I think is the answer.
Okay, we have the solution for the future. I think we should open to questions to the floor at this time. And Have I missed something of the book, a part of the book that you would like
No,
to
I
talk?
think it's, we covered it.
So let's, I think there is a mic. Could you please use a microphone?
And I may have difficulty in hearing because I...
Yeah, the question is, we have not spoken about the impact that this financial bubble or meltdown will have on many of these periphery countries, politically speaking, because I'm very much afraid that many of these nascent democracies will basically have, because of the economic crisis, since they're not that stable, will be forced to entertain different political systems, you know, like the Chavez situation or, you know, the Ortegas or the Moraleses or whatever. I wonder what your opinion is about this danger that I think is very serious for our system here.
No, I think you are absolutely right to be concerned, and unless we do it, the system will not survive. However, when you look at the troublemakers in the world, the Bolivarian Revolution, if you have oil over $100, you can have a Bolivarian revolution. With oil at 70, Chavez days are numbered. Iran, Russia, these countries, and you see, you had because of the commodity bubble and particularly the high price of oil, you had this strange phenomenon of countries rich in natural resources having autocratic regimes opposed to the United States and also opposed generally to, let's say, what I call open society. And I think that if only we were willing to stand up for those principles of open society and be concerned with the system, not only with our self-interest, then I think those dictators or what I call patronage societies would deflate, and we would actually have a more stable political system. But for that, we have to change fundamentally what we stand for and recognize that we have, having had a leading position in the world, we have an obligation to the world, which we have absolutely abandoned.
Along the lines of ethical obligations, looking at a larger picture, I go back to the South Sea bubble in England in the 1700s, as well as John Law's, I'll call it economic pathology, where he took us off coins and went to currency. And those were de facto empty of any morality. They were totally schemes, if you will, and we know about Enron, but it appears as though the same thing, and my concern, I'm actually a pastor, is that we don't have any reverence for all people except me, rather than me and thee. I mean, what are we going to do to get back integrity and sanity into the soul so we don't get on these hyper games of greed?
Well, you know, you raise a very big issue, but I have to point out that the saying pecunia non olet, money doesn't smell, related to money which was coins, not paper. So it is in the nature of markets that they are actually amoral. Morality doesn't enter into the markets. That's one of the reasons why they function very well. now, if I may say,
There's no reflexivity.
what?
There's no reflexivity then.
Well, no, there is reflexivity,
kind.
but you don't have the moral issues in a well-functioning market. However, exactly because morality doesn't enter into the market mechanism, you can't leave it to the market mechanism to take care of all the political issues that need to be resolved. And that's why you need politics, which is not, in other words, that's what's wrong with market fundamentalism, the idea that you can leave it all to the markets. No, there are moral issues, there are political issues, and those issues, that's where morality does enter into it. And that's where I think that in some ways we have been unfaithful to our own principles.
Let's have one at a time, I think. Okay.
Let me say, with all due respect, Mr. Soros, that I think you have the self-reinforcing causation exactly backwards. You say that the government has helped markets every time there's been a crisis. Rather, I would say that markets, when they get out of line, have a natural tendency to correct and deleverage as people lose money, you know. However, the government's response, time and time again, has been to re-lever the system, perpetuating the malinvestment caused by the last bubble and creating new malinvestment by further distorting market prices. Thus, today we are paying the piper for reinflating the bubbles of the past. For example, the Fed transformed the tech bubble into the bigger real estate bubble via negative interest rates, which you've talked about, negative real interest rates. Now, even the US Treasury cannot lever enough to counter the deleveraging we see throughout the real economy necessary by decades of malinvestment. If we had just let the previous bubbles run their course rather than letting the government transform them into bigger bubbles via easy credit, we would not have the super bubble as we do now. Thoughts?
Well, you know, you can argue that it's all the fault of the regulators. But if you didn't have central banks, if you didn't have market regulators, you wouldn't actually have functioning markets. So you would have a much more primitive existence. You wouldn't have had this super bubble, because that is clearly generated by the regulators. But you effectively would not have the global capitalist system, which you think could function without government regulation.
Wait. Let me just add to that I think the central banks get too much credit for the good things and too much blame for the bad things. Greenspan is the extreme of that. I think he had a good run.
Yeah. Look, ever since you've had financial markets, you have had financial crises. And the history of central banking, of the whole market, has been crises followed by reforms. That's how central banking developed. You only had the Federal Reserve System since, 1912. So it's the crises and the response to crises that then led to reforms that led to the evolution of regulation. In following that gentleman's ideology, for the last 25 years, we abandoned the need for regulation. We responded, actually, in 1982, when you had the global banking crisis, and the banks were broke. Mm-hmm. If you didn't intervene, the system would have broken down right then, because every bank would have been bankrupt. But the central banks got together, and the IMF lent money to Chile and Brazil. I visited Chile in 1982 to look at the mountains of debt. I went to Chile. So the central banks lent enough money and forced the banks to lend money to Chile and Brazil so that they could pay the interest. Mm-hmm. And then they allowed the banks free hand to make as much money as possible, very steep yield curve, very good earnings. And now after 5 years or so of great misery in Latin America, the banks got fat, and you could actually restructure the bonds and introduce Brady bonds. And you got out of the crisis. So had you not done that, the system wouldn't be there today. That's why I'm saying that the gentleman is on the wrong track.
One of the things that I think we can be fairly clear of is that a response to this current crisis will lead to greater regulation. One question I have for you is, do you think that in generally, both in the United States and globally, it will lead to over-regulation and overshoot what we need to do? Do you think that there will be too much hesitancy and we will undershoot the level of regulation that you need? And what do you think the consequences will be of either overshooting or undershooting, in your opinion?
Well, I think if history is any guide, you then go back to regulation. And I think it would be a very unfortunate outcome because one has to, I argue that this ideology which says that markets are perfect is wrong. But one has to recognize that regulations are also wrong, imperfect. And in fact, they are more imperfect than markets because regulators are not only human, but they are also bureaucratic, and they are also subject to political influences. So wherever possible, you want to use the market mechanism. In other words, you don't want to regulate more than you have to. However, I think you must regulate credit as well as money. And that does require more regulation. And hopefully, we will avoid over-regulation. But undoubtedly, financial business will not be as profitable as it has been in the last 25 years. The financial institutions won't represent 25% of the market capitalization of the stock exchange, and won't represent, I think, they were 40% of the corporate earnings were financial earnings. That was an excess, and that we will not come back to. And regulation will certainly make business unprofitable, and certain business models that rely on excessive leverage, like, for instance, long-term capital management, will prove to be unworkable.
But the risk is that all that may move to the periphery or to the shadow financial market. No? You regulate the regulated system, and then you get very high leverage in hedge funds and places you can regulate very well.
No, I don't think so, because you regulate hedge funds through the banks that
themselves,
because the banks have to have risk adjustment, and the amount of leverage in hedge funds ought to be taken into account.
Thank you for coming, Mr. Soros. I'm not going to ask you to predict the future, but I noticed three apparent contradictions in what you said here, and maybe you can address them. You said the world's going to become less U.S.-centric, but at the same time, you also say countries like Russia and the Middle East will have a lot less power because of the declining price of oil. So how does that work? Because that's the U.S.'s greatest enemies.
Let me answer one by one, because my memory doesn't.
But then just address two of them, not three.
The U.S. will cease to be the undisputed dominant force that can impose its will on the world. For instance, hopefully China will move towards a more democratic form of government and will be part of the world system. Will have to have a lot more weight than it currently has. The veto power that we have in the IMF has to disappear. So we'll be downsized, but at the same time, hopefully, we will have a better working system, and the opponents will be more downsized than we will be.
Thank you for that. Next point would be, isn't this one of several books that you've written about the end of, capitalism or whatever
Yes.
current
Yes.
thing?
Yeah, I've cried wolf 3 times. First in 1987, then in 1997, and now. And the third time the wolf came. And and basically I was commenting on the same super bubble and the error of market fundamentalism. And honestly, I didn't think that we would get out of the 97, 98 crisis. And it was only by these excesses in making money available, etc., that we got out of it. And also, people like me who saw the bubble, the housing bubble, expected it to burst much sooner. I mean, in 2006. And the real damage was done in the last 2 years. If it had burst in 2006 instead of 2007, probably we would not be at the end of the super bubble, because the system would have survived. Pardon?
Do you think you can manually burst a bubble?
Okay.
Do you think central banks?
Let's move on. Next question.
Hi, Mr. Soros. So you have a proven track record of being not only a financier, but also, a philanthropist and a political activist. But on the other hand, many of the actions you've done in the past have been a bit controversial. So take, for example, back in 1992, Black Wednesday. Your quantum fund had a $10 billion bet against the British pound. And profits from that transaction amounted to about $1 billion. But afterwards, it threw the British economy into chaos. Housing prices, interest rates, whatnot. And similarly, back in 1997, during the Asian, financial crisis, Thai nationalists depicted you as a sort of a economic war criminal. My question is, given my understanding is that you no longer work, you no longer do trades. You're more focused on sort of your political activism and philanthropy. But during your time as a hedge fund manager, how did you balance between your role as a hedge fund manager versus any drastic implications that your trades, your speculation could have on the economy and foreign economies?
Very, very simply and very clearly, I played by the rules. I was the market. I was a member of the market. I was doing what other people in the market were doing, and it was all according to the rules. And therefore, whatever I did has absolutely no negative moral implications. At the same time, as a citizen, I was concerned with making the rules better. So, and I'm still concerned. And I think one has to distinguish between the two things. Being a participant, you play by the rules, whatever they are. And as a citizen, you should be concerned with making the rules better, even if they hurt your own interest. And that's what made me controversial, because I actually very often, even today, argue against my own interests as a hedge fund manager. But as a hedge fund manager, I would continue to do the things that I was doing, and I see absolutely not any trace of anything reprehensible in my speculation against sterling. And actually, it so happens that the British benefited from the breaking of the artificially high price. So actually, I did them a service, but I didn't do it. I didn't do it in order to do them a service.
Why didn't you go after the franc?
Huh?
Why didn't you go after the French franc?
Well, actually,
Okay, next question.
So, Mr. Soros, I wanted to first thank you for your ideas that you've contributed to us about reflexivity and about imperfect markets. And I wonder if you could tell us, as MBA students and as students of finance, what tools or what ideas you think we can rely on or we can use in our own investment decisions.
Well, I hope to discuss that tomorrow with the professors in economics, because there's one thing that actually is untrue in my book about the new paradigm. It isn't yet the new paradigm. I work by it. I believe in it. I think it's right. It provides a better explanation of how financial markets operate, but it hasn't been accepted by the profession, and they haven't yet used it. I hope that they will, and they will develop the answer to your question. I don't have it.
Keep your secrets. You keep your secrets.
No, I go by it, but I know how uncertain the world is, and I mean, as I say, it's really quite humbling that with all my understanding, I can't get it right in the market. However, I know that I may be wrong, and I'm out to correct my mistakes. So the reason that I had superior performance is because I correct my mistakes.
Mr. Soros, I'd like to propose an amendment to your mortgage restructuring plan that might help it overcome the constitutional problem. As you know, the Fifth Amendment prevents the taking of property without due process of law. But there have been examples in the history of the United States where there have been governmental interventions, such as foreclosure holidays, which have passed constitutional muster. My suggestion would be that when you write down the mortgage to 80%, 85%, whatever it is, that you give the lender, the holder of the notes, a contingent interest equal to the balance or maybe even a premium to give them some kicker on top of it, which they would then have a first lien on, so if there ever was an uptick in the sale of the house, they would get that money back. I don't know if that would pass muster, but it would have a lot more moral appeal to a lot of people, because who wants to see people get written off mortgages on bad loans in the first place? And I think that's what I would suggest.
I think it's a very good suggestion. And I think it should be part of the plan.
Mr. Soros, I very much like your theory of reflexivity, but I think it has one fatal flaw when compared with market fundamentalists, which is that it doesn't have a well-formulated mathematical theory. There's no proof, there's no theorem or something like that. Do you agree, and maybe are you trying to do something about that? This
is the issue that I hope to resolve. Because it cannot be modeled the way currently models work. The question is, can you develop other models that take uncertainty into account, or the uncertainty connected with reflexivity? Or do you just have to add, let's say, an extra provision for uncertainty on the existing models? That's what I would hope to see.
We'll talk more. I mean, we have what's called Knight in uncertainty, which incorporates some of these elements.
Yes. I mean, I did read Knight, and I think we are coming back to Knight. Yes. Risk, uncertainty, profit. And the risk calculations have become so elaborate and so impressive that uncertainty has been forgotten. Now, how do you put uncertainty, which by its nature cannot be quantified? How do you put that into a quantitative model?
We're trying. We're trying.
I'd be very interested. This will be the subject of discussion.
Yes,
That's why I
sure.
came up here for.
Okay, perfect.
Mr. Soros, we've discussed or heard a lot about the bad mortgage loans and how they've contributed to the financial meltdown. And I'm just wondering, I haven't read much about the bad loans for mergers and acquisitions, which are absolutely
You will.
enormous.
Yes.
And my question to you is, how much does that play in the whole meltdown? And also, how much of the $700 billion seems to be funneled towards supporting those enormous loans and actually continuing and expanding those loans because of the, at least in part, the incredible incentive that the executives have for adding to their bonus pool, and that's where their big profits are. There's a lot of structural incentive for taxes and accounting reasons why that continues. But I'm just wondering, what can we do to avoid continuing and even expanding that right now by the use of government money?
No, I think you're absolutely right. That's yet to come. In other words, that's a shoe that's yet to fall, because it takes time for those highly leveraged deals to mature, where the bonds are payable and they cannot be paid. So that is still to come, and I also agree with you that injecting money into the banking system by taking off toxic loans was an attempt to bail them out without the appropriate public benefit. So it was the wrong way to go about it. And I think as far as the future, you will find that those leverage deals will not be doable in the future.
I guess what I'm asking is part of the problem of corporations not getting credit due to the fact that they are so highly leveraged by past loans, and that we're just going to feed more money to support that and even expand it, because that's where the powers want it to be.
Well, look, this is facing us right now in the motor industry, in the automobile industry, where the alternative is to let the motor companies go bust with great unemployment, etc., or bailing them out. And I'm afraid that the alternative will be to bail them out. It will be probably additional to the $700 billion.
Mr. Soros, you made an interesting comment in the beginning when you said that we cannot predict the future and we'll always make mistakes predicting the future because it is mostly dependent on the actions that we take in the present. So in light of what has happened recently, do you think that the markets have spent a lot of time making models to predict the future rather than thinking about what actions they are taking?
Markets did what?
The markets have spent a lot of time making models to predict the future rather than thinking about the actions that they should be taking in the present.
Well, I do believe that the models which have become so influential, both in creating the synthetic instruments and in risk management, particularly the risk management models, were based on a false understanding of how financial markets operate. And that is at the core of the severity of the current crisis.
Okay, let's take two more questions.
So this question is about the role of science in this new paradigm. This summer at the Santa Fe Institute of Complexity Science, you called for gathering all these many fields of science to integrate what we think of the market as a complex system. For example, we know that evolutionary biology plays a part in financial markets. We know that physics phase transitions just plays into market returns. On a larger note, how do you think complexity science will play into the restructuring of classical economic theory? And how do you think the best way to go about that restructuring would be?
Well, that is another borderline issue that I think needs to be explored in connection with reflexivity, because there's clearly an affinity between evolutionary biology, evolutionary systems theory, and reflexivity. What exactly is that affinity? I think that reflexivity is one particular form of evolutionary systems because they are human systems with thinking participants. But there are similarities with formation of cities or formation of anthills or whatever. So exactly what one of the troubling aspects of my theory is that I draw a sharp line separating natural phenomena from human phenomena. And that sharp line somehow doesn't seem to agree with nature. In other words, it's something that is imposed by my interpretation of reality, not reality itself. And that's one of the issues that I would like to explore, and that's why I went there to discuss it.
Mr. Soros, I agree very much with your analysis of the cultural and ideological roots of this crisis. What worries me is that a lot of economists formed, educated in market fundamentalism, work in the international institutions and will manage the crisis. To this aspect, I wonder whether you have some suggestions on how we should teach economics from now onwards to avoid that our economists continue to look at the real world on the basis of models that do not take into account real behavior.
Yes. No, that's what I hope, that, as I say, I hope that the paradigm will actually become a paradigm, that somehow it will be incorporated in the teaching of economics. I mean, that goes beyond my powers, and it does require other people absorbing the theory and rethinking the models that they are using, and either developing new models or making allowance for the uncertainty connected with reflexivity.
On that note, you can take some courses in the econ department. It will work. Anyway, so let me thank Mr. Soros for an incredibly interesting participation.